So, racial gamification, this is your term of art, reacting critically against the tenor of discussion, both on the right and I gather to some degree on the left, about racial diversity in higher education. Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what I call racial gamification is just this idea that we are encouraged to see our identities as either a opportunity lubricant or a source of opportunity friction, right? And so this sense that it can be advantageous to us in hiring or admissions or whatever to position ourselves in a certain way to play up or play down certain aspects of our racial identity. I was a college admissions tutor during grad school to make money during the summers, and I would have Black kids that would want to make sure that their essay topics telegraphed Blackness in a certain way, right? So they might talk about a particular kind of racial trauma. They might talk about being stopped by the cops and the anxiety that causes or whatever. And the sense I usually got was not that that was what they thought best encapsulated them as a person, but rather this is what some anonymous admissions committee would want to see to make sure that you were someone deserving of affirmative action. The flip side of that, though, and the thing I'm really at pains to point out is that racial gamification isn't just something that minorities are compelled to do. You also see it with white folks. You see it with Asian folks in particular, which is something I wrote about with the New York Times. With white kids, it often took the form of I may be rich and I may be white, but my dad is an alcoholic, or I struggle with anxiety and depression, right? So trying to prove that you have some kind of protected or diversity status, even though you might be a rich white kid who lives in a loft in, Manhattan. And with Asian kids in particular, there was a lot of anxiety about stereotypical Asianness. So, the first tutoring gig I ever had, I showed up at this young woman's house in Flushing in Queens. And she had already written all her application materials. And she gave them to me and said, I want you to look over these and make sure I don't come across as a stereotypical Asian. So we spent 20 minutes debating, is chess club too Asian? Is math club too Asian? And it was a really uncomfortable exercise. And it really clued me into the way in which something about affirmative action, which I nonetheless broadly supported, had really gone off the rails, and we've departed really severely from the spirit of affirmative action, which is about lifting up the poor, particularly poor minorities, to something else entirely.
I'm reading you and I'm saying, yeah, this gamification stuff is whack, but it is a natural step down the logical chain from starting point where I'm trying to compose a class of students that's quote unquote diverse. And
Mhm.
where by that diversity, I don't mean some of them are Mormons and some of them are Jews and some of them are Catholics, or some of them are conservatives and some of them are Marxists, or some of them are artists and some of them are literary people. What I mean is some of them belong in this box and some of them belong in that box. So I don't see how you do boxes without doing gamification. And I don't see why the critique of gamification doesn't reach all the way down to a critique of the boxes. What do we want from our
Yeah,
students? We want them to be intellectually interesting. We want them to be talented. We want them to be creative. But why do we need them to be a Black or a Latino or an Asian or whatever? Why is that emphasis so prominent in our decisions about how to allocate opportunity for elite higher education? Long question, but you get the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would say, as somebody who's on the left, is that I think the spirit of affirmative action, right, is about redressing the historical exclusion of minorities and other kinds of folks from the university. That's the spirit of it. I'm on board with that as a basic project. Where I think we've really gone off the rails is in two directions. One is through the lens of trauma, which is really the lens through which students are encouraged to write their application materials. And I think that's disturbing and distressing and asks people to perform a certain kind of caricatured racial identity, which I think is weird. But also, I think there's been, as a result of affirmative action, and I really don't like using the term reverse racism because it's a term that gets co opted in certain kinds of ways. But I think the technical term would be reverse racism against Asian students in particular. And as somebody who's on the left, what distressed me most about tutoring in Queens was these kids who would have a 1550 SAT score reading and math, amazing extracurriculars, whatever, had to clear a much higher bar to have even a remote chance of admission at top schools. And what frustrated me about that was not only Was this a group of kids who were being held back on the basis of their race? It was largely a group of poor kids. Most of the Asian and Asian American students I tutored in Queens, their parents were immigrants. They were not coming from money. Their parents owned a Chinese restaurant or a dry cleaner. They barely had the money to afford paying me to tutor their kids. And yet these kids had to work much harder than basically any other group I encountered in order to have the same kinds of opportunities. That really offended me as somebody who's kind of on the Bernie Sanders swing of the spectrum, that these were not only people being held back on the basis of their race, but they were poor people being held back on the basis of their race. And, the myth of affirmative action is that it's supposed to be about lifting up poor minorities. And it's clear to me that the policy as practiced really didn't seem to do that. So I would distinguish what I would see as the spirit of affirmative action versus the sort of practical reality of how it was substantiated as a policy.
But there's something I don't understand here, which is, because there's a flip side of that. The Black kids who are coming to elite colleges are not, on the whole, poor kids. They're kids that are coming from relatively
Absolutely.
advantaged homes. Why isn't this argument the basis of a critique of affirmative action to court?
Because I can imagine a version of affirmative action that is not nearly as objectionable. I think the history of American slavery and Jim Crow and what gets called structural racism is an ugly history, and our history is imperfect. And I tend to think that the policies to redress that history, it might make sense that they're also imperfect and ugly. I don't think affirmative action is a perfect system. I don't think there's any way to make it a perfect system. And I wouldn't argue that you can. I think, Glenn, I totally agree with your, the turtles all the way down point, right? That I think there is some inherent trade-off to affirmative action, even in a kind of minimal or in a way that achieves the spirit of affirmative action. I think I'm willing to countenance those trade-offs on the whole if we could imagine a system that was more narrowly geared toward lifting up poor minorities. And to your point, our system, the one that was just dismantled, did not do that in the slightest. I went to Haverford College outside of Philly, a kind of fancy liberal arts college. I arrived, someone from the working class, imagining that the other Black students I encountered would be members of the working class, and they were from Greenwich, Connecticut, and they drove Lexuses. One of them was family friends with Barack Obama, who he would see during the summers, and it became really clear to me, and this is the other flip side of racial gamification. It's not just something that college students do. It's also something that colleges do, right? So Haverford College was able to admit a bunch of wealthy Black kids and get 2-for-1 deal. They got the kid who could smile on the brochure, but they also got someone who could pay full tuition. My critique of affirmative action as practice would be a class critique, that it was not helping largely poor minorities. It was helping the middle and upper class minorities who mostly could already pay their way and who went to fancy prep schools like Andover and Exeter, just lacking on advantage that those kids already have. As practiced, I would not support affirmative action at all. The distinction I'm making, Glenn, is I can imagine a version of affirmative action that is less objectionable and that I would be willing to support it despite its downsides. I can't imagine a perfect system. Emissions are by definition a zero-sum game, right? And if you're giving a leg up to some, you're inherently pushing down others. That's just how the math works. But I can imagine a version of it that is less morally objectionable and where the pros might outweigh the cons. That's very much not the system we have, though.
I want to talk about why it is that these working class Asian kids come in there with the test scores so great that they have to be discriminated against in order to keep them out. And conversely, why it is that the kids who summer with the Obamas need a leg up to get into Haverford College. Why? That's the more fundamental issue. And, we're way downstream the human developmental process here. We're talking about 18 to 22-year-olds. And we're trying to do social policy by structuring the composition of a university, which is a special kind of institution, that late in the developmental dynamic of a young person's life. And it comes at the end of the day, to me, to look like virtue signaling and bean counting. And I'm against that.